So thanks for joining us today. This event is co-sponsored by the Department of English at the University of Washington, and of course, the Tadagori Project. The event is recorded. We want to keep you guys muted until we get to the question and answer period. Once we get there, I'll be sort of facilitating this so you can use the raise hand function, or on the basis of the last conversation, if you start gesticulating madly, I'll know to call on you and invite you into the conversation. This is the second in a series of 3 conversations. Today, I'm joined by Sam Hushagen and Andres Huskas to have a conversation about literature as equipment for living. I'll be asking Sam and Andres a series of questions that are intended to foster and guide their conversation. I'm going to do my best to basically stay out of the way if a good back and forth gets underway, and to intervene to make sure we stay on track if we're down a rabbit hole that seems sort of weird. The more kind of formal side of this conversation will occupy probably the first half of our time here, and it'll be followed by a Q&A for those of you in attendance. I highly encourage you guys to join us and see what happens. We are under some tight time constraints today, so the session needs to end at 4:30 Eastern time here. So I'll be kind of marching us towards a tight cutoff to accommodate our presenters. One of the orienting ideas of the Meeting Places series is that conversations, arguments, and dialogues play a central but largely invisible role in intellectual work, and that the academy and even society at large suffers from a lack of sustained and sustaining meeting places where conversations can begin and develop. Conversations are more informal, idiosyncratic, open-ended than conventional kinds of academic presentations, and our hope today is that we will end up somewhere unexpected and/or learn or discover something genuinely new. I'm going to briefly introduce our participants before getting the conversation started. Sam Hushagen received his PhD from the University of Washington in 2019. He has served as an assistant editor at MLQ, a journal of literary history, and writes about John Milton, Enlightenment visual culture, contemporary philosophy of mind, and Georgic in British and American literature. His current book considers long-form topographical poetry from the 17th and 18th centuries in relation to post-critique and its silent incorporation of what the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars called the myth of the given. Andres is a lecturer at the Department of Nursing at the Haag University of Applied Sciences, where he teaches narrative medicine, participative healthcare, and disability studies. As a PhD candidate at Leiden University Center for the Arts and Society, he works on the intersection between disability studies and affect theory. His research examines literature and art in which affective responses are evoked and/or shared by deviant and disabled bodies, focusing on how the artwork is constructed to elicit such responses. Concurrently, through the added emphasis on emotional and affective responses provoked by disabled bodies, his research explores how art may manipulate such responses. So thanks for joining us, Sam and Andres. I want to start the conversation just by asking you both about what initially drew you to the study of literature as something you would want to do in graduate school or undergraduate. What keeps you interested in literature? And maybe we could start with you, Andres. You know, what is it about literature that excites and interests you?
So I think I started reading literature, to me, from a very young age. So I was into comic books, which to me is literature. Mm-hmm. So I used to read Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles like crazy. Was really into the Turtles, and then moved on to other comic books like Spider-Man, X-Men, was a huge X-Men fan. Mm-hmm. Saw all the animated series, and so sort of like the importance of narrative was I think what initially drew me, the importance of stories. But I didn't even know you could sort of formally study literature until I was in my early 20s. So I have a background in information science. That's what I did my undergrad in. Sort of got in touch with semiotics via that way. Got into Roland Barthes, a number of other French philosophers that way. And that was sort of a weird link. So I was still reading like comic books, novels, graphic novels, all different sort of literature. But by sort of being exposed to these kinds of theorists, I was also exposed that theory was actually an object of academic study. And so that led me to go from an undergrad in information science to a research master in comparative literature and literary theory, which was sort of like the first place I felt home, in a sense, sort of like amongst all of these other people that knew they were choosing a master's degree in something that wasn't necessarily practical, quote unquote, but sort of had co-signed their fate together into this pursuit. And I think that was really valuable to me, like that whole atmosphere where you're 24, 25, and you're just like with a bunch of people trying to figure life out, and you're on this track, where you could also sort of realize that you could have chosen accounting or economics or any sort of degree where you feel that there's a very practical value. And to sort of make a small bridge to today's title, I think like a lot of people in their undergrads and MA degrees are using literature as a way to figure life out. I think that's a huge part of what makes people still choose humanities degree in this day and age, knowing that they, in some eyes, might not choose sort of the most economically practical degree. And I was definitely one of those. So I knew, like, you know, this degree can come with risks in those terms, but I still chose it because I also wanted to sort of try and see what ways there are to figure myself out via literature. Yeah.
Beautiful. Sam, what about you?
I resonate, Andres, with what you said about finding a sense of community. I mean, I was a very disaffected high school student. I was not a particularly good student. I got, fine grades. I went to Nathan Hale High School here in Seattle, and Nathan Hale had avoided introducing, like an honors program or an advanced placement program for, I think, what are justifiable reasons is, those tend to produce a kind of two-tiered hierarchy within high schools where you have a kind of elite, almost universally white upper middle class school within a large urban school. And to avoid that, they had just decided not to. But one of the problems I run into is there was no challenge in the curriculum that had largely been imposed by the Bush administration. Those of us who went to school in the aughts are familiar with No Child Left Behind, and the kind of movement towards standardization that brought with it, which meant like we weren't reading novels. We weren't reading, anything longer than, excerpts of speeches, things that could be readily assessed in a standardized format. And absolutely no poetry. I mean, like, I don't remember reading a poem at all in my high school education. And in junior year, I had no idea what I was going to do. I wasn't even really thinking about college at that time. And I know my parents were like, well, where are you going to go to college? Where are you going to go to college? And I had no real interest. And in junior year, there was a hire for the junior language arts program at Nathan Hale, who was an interim sort of ad hoc employee brought in to kind of fill a staffing gap for the year, named Mark Ottaviani. I remember his name distinctly. He was a young guy. He was probably in his late 20s, early 30s, from New York, thick Brooklyn accent. He'd left New York. He'd been teaching in Harlem during 9/11, left New York after 9/11 because he just didn't want to be there anymore. And this was in 2003. So he got a job at Nathan Hale. And I remember he pulled my card one day after class and said, like, look, you're turning in bullshit. You're producing bad work. And like, I know you're capable of more than that. And it was one of the first time I'd been called out like that. I mean, I think, if you have read some stuff and you're sort of fine at writing, you can really get by on a lot of bullshit in high school, and it can sap any sense of like value from the work you're doing. And he was the first to really kind of like push. And so what he did, he was like, look, I want to talk to you like one day a week or one day every 2 weeks. It was very informal. He would give me books. He gave me Nabokov. He gave me Ishiguro. He gave me Smilla's Sense of Snow. He gave me Kafka. And it wasn't like they were tests, like we would sit down, we just sort of talk about what we'd read. And I'd never had that experience before. Like my house wasn't a reading house. And to see one like an adult man who I looked up to, who I admired, emoting, getting like visibly emotional, willing to cry publicly without shame, and like demonstrating a kind of role that I didn't really know existed, and a kind of way of being in the world that I didn't really know existed, profoundly influenced the choices I subsequently made. So I studied English and intellectual history at the UW as an undergrad. But I didn't really settle on continuing, maybe going to graduate school, until I took a course with the late Herbert Blau. If you ever knew Blau, you know exactly why by mentioning Blau. He was like 5'6", with bad knees, and I don't know, 87 when I met him, and just so full of vigor and energy and rage, and I mean, he would just fill a room. And what Blau drove home is, I took a class on modern poetry with him. And on the first day, he came in and rattled off, complacencies of the peignoir and hot coffee and oranges, all of Stephen's Sunday Morning, off the top of his head at 87 years old, and slammed the table and said, "This fucking matters." It was startling and strange. Blau had a penchant for performance as a longtime theater guy. And it really drove home the stakes of what literary studies can be and can do. Like, this matters. He made it clear, those great lines from Williams: "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what there is found there." Blau made that clear, and he made it clear that this was like something that I wanted. This was something that meant something to me, in spite of all the kind of economic practicalities that Andres mentioned, and that I very much live with now. It continues to be a kind of source of vigor and energy that I credit Herb Blau with.
Great. Both your responses, really resonate, of course, with the line we have stolen from Kenneth Burke. Of course, the idea that in some way literature is equipment for living. And I wonder if each of you could speak a little bit about, clearly living is a part of what you've both addressed here, but how do you think about equipment in your own work? Obviously the literary text might be considered equipment, or your colleagues or your institutions. I mean, how do you see literature broadly conceived as some kind of equipment in figuring out who you are, leading a life, discovering yourself as a person? Sam, maybe take that one, and I'll kick it back to Andres.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like I have to confess a kind of love-hate relationship with that essay from Burke, in part because if you know the essay, Burke starts out by talking about, what is it? Proverbs, right? Like the kind of Oxford Handbook of Proverbs. And what makes Proverbs cool is that they like name a situation. And so he's basically doing a kind of literary typology, where it's like, here is a kind of typical situation that is relatable, broadly applicable, that we have a kind of, a tag for. And my resistance to that characterization of the literary as, like Proverbs, is that it seems so dubious to reduce a complex, multifaceted, singular, and often challenging work like a poem, like a novel, to a kind of like a proverbial maxim. Like, you know, if you've ever seen children's editions of Aesop's Fables, where they give you the italics message at the bottom, in case you missed it through like the narrative portion, like that's the move. And like, I don't like that, but I don't think that's actually what Burke is doing with that example. Like, I think he is doing something more interesting. And this is in part, like, I've done some research and writing on typology. And like, you know, there are ways to think about that kind of typological reasoning. Like, this is a type, this is a situation, this is a kind of structure that we can apply, that doesn't fall into that kind of reductive logic of the italicized message of a narrative or whatever. And so when I think about what Burke is trying to think about literature as equipment for living, and sort of thinking about your question, James, I don't know, it comes back to the classroom for me, right? One of the things that is so radical and interesting about reading poems or novels in the context of teaching, and particularly like general education teaching, is, you know, we have this text, we have a kind of fixed set of constraints and 20 or 30 different people looking at them. And it's an infrastructure, it's a scaffold that we are, you know, both like we're engaging with it, kind of one person to object. I'm trying to read this line of poetry, I'm trying to read this poem, but I'm also trying to read the people around me, right? I'm looking at the way the person next to me is looking at that poem, and the person next to me, or my spouse, or my colleagues, or my peers, or anybody that I'm engaging in this sort of active communion with. This is what I think Burke means by this is like sociological, right? Is that it has to do with kind of normative horizontal relations, not just the kind of individual text relation. And he wants to kind of, I think, rupture that individual text and say it's always sort of triangulated through other people, other minds, other ways of making sense. And so, you know, it gives us a kind of scaffold. It gives us an object, a thing that we can orient our attention towards, and something that we can use to calibrate one another. So we're both looking at, the text I always use for this is Margaret Atwood's "You Fit Into Me." Does anybody know this poem? It's 16 words, 2 stanzas. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. It's very simple, very stark, you know, arrayed in like 2 kind of couplets, with a nice little metaphor in the middle. And students often, you know, we all kind of leap to the fish hook and the open eye because it's so visceral, that we miss the kind of complexities of the empty space in the middle and the first metaphor, which, you know, hooks and eyes, that could be a clasp, that could be, you know, any number of kind of enclosing spaces. It's resonant with, you know, all the characterizations of Aphrodite or love or Cupid as a maker of lures, like fish hooks, of course. So, you know, she's tapping into this huge ancient literary history in, again, these stark 16 lines. And so as I'm watching my students, as I'm watching my peers try and make sense of this and reach conclusions about it, I'm calibrating my judgment to theirs, and they're calibrating their judgment to mine, right? We're giving reasons for why we reach the conclusions that we reach, and they're giving reasons for why they reach the conclusions that they're reaching. And in doing so, we're basically creating the kind of the necessary conditions for sociality, which might be a little extreme, but I think that's what Burke really means when he says this is equipment for living. Living as humans means living with other minds and living with other people, other full persons. It is not ever a kind of singular or isolated thing because, again, of our nature as human beings. And so it's equipment for living in the sense that it provides the kind of necessary structuring for normative, intersubjective experience.
Beautifully put. Andres, I'm sure you're going to have some interesting things to say about that. How do you take literature to be equipment for living? I mean,
I think like when you compare literature to other media like films or live theater or performances, I think like when you're watching a film, or if we were both watching the same film, right, I can sort of poke your arm and say, did you see that? Or like, and that's I think is a very specific mode of engagement. It's like, it's similar with painting. You can talk about it. You're watching the same object. But I remember like 12 years ago, when 50 Shades of Grey came out, everybody was reading that book, right? So I would sit on a train and they're like, everybody's sort of reading this book in public. But it's really interesting in the sense that you see the cover of the book, but you don't get any access to what's happening between the reader and the text, right? So if you would look at sort of a pornographic film and you're looking at that together, right, you're both seeing the same thing. But the whole, I think, point with literature is that you don't really get initial access to what you're reading on the page and what I'm reading on the page. We can talk about it, right? I think that's what Sam's talking about. We can talk about it afterwards, but you don't get that initial sort of same viewing experience. And so to me, when Burke's talking about strategies also as equipment for living, or literature as being able to sort of give different strategies, to me what's super interesting is, yes, but like it's this kind of two-step thing. So it's your first initial relationship with the text, which is very private and which I think always, in a sense, elicits a kind of voyeurism. So it's always like, if you're external to it, it's always like, well, how are you reading that text? Like, what's your experience of it? Which you will never really gain access to. And then this whole idea of literature being a kind of model or a model for strategy or attitude, in the way Burke talks about it. And so to me, like, there's always been, in a way, a distance between these two things. So the experience that I have with a text, which I feel I can never completely divulge or share with a third party, even though that's sort of like the starting point of having conversations like these, is that you still try to attempt to talk about what's happening for you in a text. And then the other part is, well, how is the strategy, right? So how do you adopt an attitude? And I think in a very plain way, literature gives you different genres. So it gives you lyric, or it gives you narrative, or all these genres through which you can live life. But I think also it gives you other things like a sense of rhythm, or things that are a lot less concrete or less tangible, that I think also play into strategy or attitude in real life. And I think, yeah, like, to me, that's sort of the thing that I'm very interested in with literature. Sort of, so what different modes of relationality can it afford? And in my own teaching and my own experience, for example, people who don't have a lot of experience with lyric, the very fact that enunciation is a way to deal with literature, speaking out loud or reciting a poem as a mode of relationality, can be super liberating. I think to a lot of people, like when you recite a poem out loud, people can be like, there can be a sense of trepidation to that first initial experience. Once they sort of find their voice in relation to the text, actual physical voice, that can be a super liberating experience to students, in my experience. So yeah, I really like those kinds of to figure those kinds of things out with other people.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me, I think, yeah, you guys should go. Sam, you get right back in. Yeah.
I have a, like, one, and this is something I try and think through. Like, I liked what you had to say about like that kind of initial interaction, that initial encounter with the text, and like, how do we think that experience? And part of what I want to always say is like, there's a kind of tacitly normative dimension to it, that like, and if I'm reading a poem and like my immediate impression is a certain impression, there's a dimension of ought to that, right? Like I am encountering it this way and others ought to too. And I think it's part of the provocation of the literary, is then I have to like test that ought, right? Do others in fact, fulfill that? And there's a kind of, I mean, this is where like, Andres, I'm really interested in your work on like disability, because there's a certain kind of potentially ableist, a certain, I don't know, like I'm a white dude in Seattle, heteronormative, racially normative dimension to that, a bodily normative dimension to that I'm like, I'm never fully comfortable with, because it's an ought. And I think ought is a kind of problematic term. Like, if I am encountering this thing in this way, ought everyone to, and I don't know that is like, there's nothing apodictic about it. There's nothing sort of this, everyone must, but there is this sort of dimension that like, I have an expectation that others will have a kind of similar encounter?
God, it's got to be now. I'll just jump in. I have a break between my first two classes, and I sit with a group of young students who are starting into literature and quite nervous about it. And the intensity they have is, did I get it right? Did I get it right? You know, they want a certain sense of mastery, and both of what you're sort of saying is wielding a literary text is at once a sort of tacit, personal, maybe even privative kind of act. And then at the same time, we enter the classroom or the reading or the dinner party, right? And then we enter into this sort of exchange, and it is a normative exchange. But one thing that, you know, I think all teachers learn to say is like, well, there isn't one right answer, but there are many wrong, there are many wrong ways to use this text. There are many wrong ways to wield the equipment that is literature. And I think that kind of brings us to the next thing I was interested in, which is how what role you see criticism playing in relation to literature. You know, you're both people who are teaching, you're teaching in different places, you're teaching different materials. Oftentimes the lingua franca of people like us is theory or criticism, but I think, you know, when we were putting this together, you two struck me as interesting people to have a conversation, mostly because of the idiosyncrasies of the kinds of criticism you're interested in. And so I wonder, Andres, you know, how do you see criticism, you know, attending to the literary? What's the role or the space of criticism for you?
Yeah, so I'll come to that, but like first I want to very briefly respond to Sam's art, like the normative art, and also what you were saying, James, about students sort of the relationship of students saying, did I get it right? Which to me, I always call the hermeneutic key. So students have an idea of a hermeneutic key, like when you read, especially with poetry in my experience, where I think primary school and high school teach poetry in such a way that there's this one right interpretation, right? This hermeneutic key, and you're supposed to sort of uncover that as a student, as an attitude. And I'll link to criticism in a bit. But I think like what's super interesting to me is that there's this sentence by Barbara Johnson in Persons and Things, where she says that the authority of the poet does not rest on what he says, but on his capacity to call. And in that sense, like in that book, Persons and Things, she doesn't really unpack that statement. But it sort of struck me in relation to what Sam was saying, like this ought to, because I think like when we talk about literature, but I think lyric poetry especially, is that we sort of analyze the effects that literature has, rhetorical effects or these different effects. But if you take Johnson's statement seriously, like the capacity to call, like what is that? What is the capacity to call? Like it almost could sound like a mystic kind of statement. But if you look at literature as a practice, one of the things that I like to ask of my students, and I think you probably also do this in your classes, is to ask them to actually recite a poem out loud after reading it. And very often, if you ask a student, was there a difference between reading it in your mind silently and then hearing yourself reciting the poem out loud, they almost always say, yes, there was. And I think like this is a really important way of relating literature to criticism, because criticism is in a way a practice of silent study, right? You read the text in silence, not so much in a community of people. And so to me, to come back to Sam's art, what's super important is that this art, I think, can sort of be disabled by having students recite things out loud, because then they have the experience of like, okay, I had this poem in one way in my mind, but reciting it out loud, my body almost trips over the poem, or my body sort of starts to stutter at certain rhythms in the poem or at certain words in the poem. And that whole experience is super important to me also in relation to criticism. So because like with criticism, we're very often only concerned with the rhetorical effects of the text. What is an apostrophe, or what does the apostrophe do in this poem, without sort of really asking of the student, like, wait, what happens when you recite this poem out loud? And that, I think, is a super important part of being together in a classroom, rather than only practicing criticism in silence in your room. So I think like that part of criticism is not often, at least in my experience, not often emphasized enough. So it's more than just reading and writing, but it's always a communal practice. Yeah.
Perfect. Sam, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with like that. It's always a communal practice. I often think like criticism is the condition that makes literature possible, which seems kind of anachronistic. It reverses the order, right? Like literature makes criticism possible, right? But there is no literary without the kind of that testing, that calibrating, that attempt to clarify and refine your impressions, your sense. I mean, especially, Andres, I really like you said about vocalizing. Because yeah, it changes the relationship to the object. It turns it into something that isn't just semantic content. I think that's what you meant by like, the rhetorical, but is actually something physiological, something that has rhythm, something that imposes bodily recalcitrance. Like it actually physically resists your body when you try and give voice to it. And that's my kind of question there. Like I often give my students just like, here's like, it's very, very new critical and old school. Like here's 5 lines of a poem, just like write about them. Tell me what they mean. And I did this a few years ago in a course on lyric with the final lines of Whitman's Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, where, he describes the word up from the wave, the key. And I had always struggled. I was like, what the f is the key? What is the key? What is it opening? And all it took was like one smart student to be like, look, bro, he's not talking about a lock. He's talking about music. Like it's a musical key. And all of a sudden it was like, blew my mind. And I this is one of the kind of problems with, I think, that tendency towards, in your head kind of solitary work. And this is where the teaching dimension is so important, is we get so fixed in our ways of seeing and engaging that I couldn't disabuse myself that this was a kind of mechanical metaphor and not a kind of auditory one, not a sound metaphor. And that metaphor of harmonizing, that way of thinking, I think is actually a kind of a purpose of criticism. It's to harmonize. It's not to turn everything into Cage's Symphony in C, right? We're not just all playing the same note over and over and over for however long. But it's to kind of make a kind of resonance across the dissimilar, out of which something like social intelligibility, collective intelligibility becomes possible. And so I think that is sort of, that's intrinsic to the literary as such, that activity. And again, I think if you've ever had exactly, Andres, that sort of, I poked a person like, did you see that impulse is the critical impulse fundamentally. And I think we can do that in person, but I think it requires or working individually, working in our empty offices with, our books or whatever. It's not impossible, but it's really hard to remain alert to that kind of that dimension that requires testing, right? The dimension of the literary encounter that requires kind of putting it into language, trying to talk it out with someone else, trying to communicate your impressions. You can do that in your own head. You can do that while you're writing. I think we're always doing that when we're practicing criticism. But that's the whole reason for like a humanities education, is it creates the kind of dimensions in which those conversations are not ancillary or kind of some thing that you do as an adjunct to like advancing your reading or whatever, but that are actually the center and the focal point.
Beautifully put. You have something, Andres? It looks like you do.
Yeah, like was hearing Sam talk, I'm made to think like about the whole key, like a mechanical key or a musical key. I think that when you look at the attitudes, especially of students, in relationship to interpretation, right? I think this is, at least to me, what you alluded to, James, is like there's this kind of anxiety, right, to get it right, right? But why is that? Like, why is that students are concerned with getting it right? Could be a grade, right? Could be anxiety about getting a good grade. That's one thing. But then, sort of, when we consider the relationship of interpretation to text, right? You have exegesis, so that's about sacred text and getting those right and getting those interpretations right, which over, literal blood was spilled over. So interpretation historically has always been a very heavy, deep subject. And I think, like, even outside of grades, if you talk to people that are interested in literature and they approach me as a literary scholar, they will often even ask me, like, hey, I'm reading this book, Lolita by Nabokov. Am I reading this right? Is this what this is about? So there's always kind of, like, because I'm also interested in affect theory, there's always, in a way, a very strong emotional investment with getting things right, about interpretation. And to me, so that's already, in a way, I mentioned a mode of relationality that literature kind of affords. That's one, I think, affordance of literature, is that people somehow are trained culturally to want to get it right. And I think that's a way of dealing with text, which I think is very much culturally and historically determined, but it's not the only way in which you can relate to text. And I think, like, that, to me, is a huge assignment of literary studies and cultural studies right now, is to sort of ease off this pressure of needing to get things right, because I think that's a way of relating to literature, which is one way, and it has its value and use. But I think also learning as a scholar how to approach literature as a form of play, or as something ludic, or something different, is extremely valuable in gaining a relationship of comfort to text. So if the relationship is always very anxious, always very nervous because you're afraid of getting things right or not getting things right, then, effectively speaking, you're in a very specific domain in how you are being trained to approach text. So to me, play and the ludic is super important when I'm talking with my students, just because I can tell that that's sort of a foundation from which they are able to develop different attitudes to text, also from which they allow themselves to develop different attitudes. And I think if that remains closed, if they have a very classic sort of background, then it's about sort of getting the right answers. Whatever, it doesn't even matter that like what right answers are. It's more about a very specific relationship. I need to get things right. Like, that's kind of the bottom line. And I think that does a disservice to literature, but also to the student.
Absolutely. Sam, get in, sure.
Yeah, that makes me think about something I've been sort of struggling with a lot, which is this question that is also related to criticism. We have programs in theory and criticism. We can grant degrees in criticism, which presupposes some notion of expertise in criticism, right? Which would seem to entail, again, a kind of getting things right. And I like, can we have disciplinary expertise, all of those sort of expertise in judgment, or in, I don't know, perspicaciousness. I have no idea even how to describe it. That is not getting it right. Then, like, what does our sort of disciplinary knowledge consist? And I have no answer for that. I really I struggle with that as an idea, because I want to go back and forth and I don't know how to resolve it.
Well, one thing, I'm going to let people who are here know, we're basically open season after this. So I know there are people who are teachers who are thinking about these questions. I know some of you in the audience are here. So the last thing, one of the things that originated us wanting to organize series of conversations like this is because it had the ability to unearth the kind of stuff we're on top of now. In the last session on infrastructure, that pretty quickly turned into really interesting discussions about things like the shape of hallways and budgets and things like that. Now we seem to be, there's a much publicized so-called ever extending crisis in the humanities, crisis in literary studies, right? And I think both of you have touched on a real distinctiveness to what it means to learn how to read. And when we say reading, I mean, I say this to my students all the time, right? I'm going to teach you close reading, I say, and then I say immediately, now bear in mind, this means both reading and talking and writing, and really a way of being in the world, a set of affects, a kind of comfort in discomfort, where getting it right, the anxiety one has about getting it right is just a disaster for good reading. It also is one of the, as Sam says, the perennial temptations of disciplinary literary theory, right? The thought is always, we're going to get our way out of this crisis with a new theory. And the thing we never seem to want to talk about is, in what ways is our participation in a system entrenching ever more, a sort of dry, mechanical, non-ludic, non-playful, over-intellectualized, over, expert sense of things. And so, it's a thing that every teacher who has a curious student is always trying to account for, and it's always kind of hard. How do I learn how to read? Andres, you got ideas about how you learn how to read? How you teach someone how to read?
So I think that there are a bunch of entries into this question as a teacher. And I think one of the ways which is probably most dominant is that if you turn reading into sort of a learning objective, where you say, like these are the criteria through which you will show me that you are able to read, right? That sort of falls back into that old hermeneutical model, which I just discussed, which is over 2,000 years old. And I think I'm sort of in my mind like right now on this book that I'm reading by Elizabeth Anker. It's called On Paradox. It came out with Duke University Press. And it's kind of this intellectual history about paradox as method of modernity. It's like the thesis, her thesis is quite grand. So she's like, paradox is the rhetorical figure which has dominated modernity. Like that's her thesis. And what she does in that book is she tries to discern how paradox is figured through human rights, the whole domain of human rights, how it has basically sustained all of literary criticism from the 20th century onwards. And like she goes through all these fields in different chapters. But the interesting thing is when she gets to literary theory, right? If you read, for example, Derrida, like deconstruction is not a method, but what is it, right? You get all these negative definitions of what it's not. And to me, like that's very much in line with that old hermeneutical tradition. Like, you have to really read, like, what's he saying here? Like, this, like, it's very dense, so very dense French theory. And when I look at my students, when they engage with those texts, it's almost like we're 500 years back and people are reading the Bible, like it's always, well, what's this really? Like, it's this whole anxious atmosphere about getting it right. Like the whole atmosphere, I think, is probably very similar to how it probably was 500 years ago. Like it's the same thing. So to come to your question, like, okay, so how do you teach reading is to me really about that relationship. Like, so what's in it for you to get it right? Like what is this getting it right? What is this thing about getting it right? Sort of being a definitive answer, right? So that you can sort of pinpoint things very clearly. And what I see my students do more and more, and I think that's super interesting. I'm not sure what it says about the current time, but they're very interested in things like narratology or more structuralist approaches, which sort of give us almost like a step-by-step kind of way on how they should deal with things, because it's very solid. It's something that's very tangible, that that they always ask me, like this, they use this word apply. Well, how can I apply this to this? And that's a different way of having reading as a practice constitute the ratio between the reader and the text, I think. So like when it's about application, you know, that gives them a sense of solidness, you know, like, well, like if you give me an example, I can do that. But then my whole thing is, you know, so like we have these two different things. We have literature as something, or theory as something that I can apply, you know, where you give me an example and like show me the trick and I'll do it, versus sort of the other side of the, or the most extreme side of the spectrum being sort of Derrida's deconstruction is not a method, you know, but what is, like, it's a style, it's, you know, the definition by saying what it's not, like that's the other side of the spectrum. And so to me, the way I sort of look at reading, or also as in like teaching reading as a skill, is to always sort of go back to sensibility. So that's why I use the voice, or that's why I use different senses to sort of get into that relation between, okay, so this was my initial interpretation in my mind, but as Sam was saying, what does literature do to my body? And sort of the difference between those two things, or the discrepancy between those two things. And then, and I think that's probably the most important step, to teach them that whatever your body got to teach you about reading literature, it doesn't mean that what you had in your mind was wrong, right? That's not the point. It's about sort of being able to learn how to read with your entire body. And I think that to me is like, that's the way I'm approaching it right now. As a matter of literature as practice, reading as practice.
Beautiful. Sam, I'm sure some of that resonates.
Yeah, absolutely. And like any birders in the group? Anybody do birding? Eric, you bird? Richard, you bird? I am not a birder, but a very close friend of mine is, and he has tried to like school me. We travel and we go into the wild, we hike a lot. So my analogy to reading is birding. And I think, for one, it's embodied, as Andres was saying. It's physiological. It takes a kind of physical presence in the world, in the wild, in the world of circulation of texts and ideas. It requires, it's not attending to an object. It's not containing or capturing that object. It involves a kind of presence to what's there that can be tuned, that can be developed. I don't know if like what we're calling like close reading, or whatever kind of thing you want to append to, the reading that Huxley famously and derisively called as the new stupid, which I think is still I don't know. I have some sympathy for that, because like that's, the dominant mode of reading. We don't actually read anything. We look at it and fill in the gaps. We don't ever have to really read, because it would be exhausting if we did. But to pay attention in the way that you have to if you want to catch a glimpse of some silly little finch, or pick it out from the kind of extraordinarily noisy natural environment of circulating language, words, images, ideas, involves a really heightened sense of awareness, a kind of entrained physiological capacity for abiding discomfort, right? Like it's often not in comfortable places. Jonathan Franzen has a great essay about this from the New Yorker from like a decade ago that kind of develops a similar analogy. But like, I think, like Andres, I want to kind of proceed by like negative definitions, because it's really hard to say like what reading is or how you teach it, because it's a practice, right? It often defies that kind of propositional form of knowing that, where you could like give a guidebook, or like all of our scholarly infrastructure, all of our teaching infrastructure, how most of my colleagues teach like an introduction to literary studies. It's like, okay, here's our deconstruction week. Then we do our new historicism week. Then we're going to do our psychoanalysis week. And then we're going to do our affect week. And then we're going to do our feminist, queer, gender week. And then we're going to do our critical race theory week. And then we're going to do and so it becomes a kind of like list of menus that Henry Stanton, if you know Hank over at the UW, derisively referred to like the sausage maker model of literary criticism, where you put in all kinds of diverse things and you get the same uniform substance as you crank that sausage maker, which I think is apt for the way we often use like an approaches style or a model style of literary criticism or reading. But then what that actually looks like in the classroom, like if I when I figure it out, I'll let you all know, because I think this is something that I really struggle with hugely in my classes. Because for a lot of the reasons we've been talking about here, like I don't know, I have a lot of things I know and I think that are cool, and I have a tendency to want to share those things, which can have a kind of impact of like a magisterial performance of knowledge and mastery, which has a tendency to remove that object from the ludic, from the domain of play and interaction and bouncing around, and kind of receptivity into a kind of rarefied space of humanist specialization and expertise. At the same time, oftentimes you do need to know a lot and have a lot of kind of acquired competencies. Like any good birder will be like, I didn't come out of the womb able to pick out these birds, like I had to train these abilities. It's a certain sensitivity of sight. It's a certain ability to see movement that would be totally lost on those of us not sufficiently attuned. So it's balancing those two things, the kind of expertise modeled on the kind of physiological competencies of the birder, with that kind of ability to balance that against the openness, the receptive, that doesn't withdraw, our objects of study, our poems, or I even just turn it into objects of study, that doesn't turn them into objects, that keeps them birds, right? Hope is a thing with feathers, Dickinson says, keeps them that thing with feathers, so that we're not turning them into like specimens in the basement of the Burke Museum.
Beautiful. I want to open it now. I know there are people here who are in literary studies, people who write poems. If you have a question, feel free to pose it. I'll jump in the meantime to let people formulate this. I mean, one of the things that struck me as you guys were talking is, in one sense, I really do want to affirm there is a crisis in literary studies. There is a crisis in the humanities. And part of it owes to one of the things you've named, which is that if we expect we can stand in front of the faculty senate or Congress or the State House and explain to people in the mode of knowing that propositionally, or learning objectives or criteria, right? We're at in one sense, permanent disadvantage, because it is something that it's a transformative process, learning to read. You have to undergo it. You have to undergo it with the right people. There has to be enough space that it can go badly a few times. And none of that is in keeping with the pressures attending, student debt, cost of college, enrollments, changing economy. And so, one of the things that I worry about so much is that our modes of communicating with each other are conference presentations, which are discussions usually about specimens under microscopes, publications, which are inherently inside baseball, right? Rarefied language, all of this. Students want to get through. There's a lot that they need to know. And it oftentimes feels like that business of learning to bird, that long process of teaching each student how they might be able to read. I have students when 15 or 16 kids come into the room and they're really ready to read a poem, and some of them have, a wide array of strengths, and others haven't learned something yet. I spent most of yesterday just explaining to people why it's so important for them to write in the actual book. Eric, you say you have to duck out to a meeting. Just unmute yourself and say it. I can't.
Well,
okay.
Actually, yeah, James, what you were just saying there dovetails nicely, right? The idea of writing in the book, having a book, having an e-reader. I don't know, but I'm when you mentioned narrative medicine up at the top, I think of Rita Charon's version of that obviously involved the kind of practice of parallel charting and sort of this, keeping track of impressions, which I think might be especially important when people start, because they're not sort of aware that they're having these impressions that they might be tracking, right? But like English departments are sort of famous administratively for like not needing much, right? That like budgetarily you just sort of like need to pay for the instructor. Maybe you give them an office, maybe you give them a closet like Sam. but it's like, do we require equipment, and what is that? Is it just like a roof? Is it a book? I'm kind of curious about that question that's sort of emerged through different parts of the conversation.
Yeah, what do people think about that? Andres, do you have anything to say about that?
So I think like one of the topics that I think we sort of skirted around without making it explicit is the notion of creativity within the humanities. So I think we've sort of co-signed creativity to the arts rather than having creativity also being sort of part and parcel of our own practice. And to come to your question, Eric, I think that when you look at something like narrative medicine and co-charting, I think that sort of comes into a mode of creativity which might become part of the humanities again, or that can become part of the humanities again. And I think my initial impression with creativity within the humanities is, on the one hand, that's sort of like people are experimenting with that via something like auto theory or genres which are sort of up and coming, which I think have a very diffuse reception. Some people are very into it, other people completely condemn it and think it's unscholarly. But to me, the very fact that there are people that are trying things out is, I think, super important to how our field will develop. And I think that ties into the students' needs in two ways. One way is that I'm not sure how it is in the States, but over here in the Netherlands, students sort of come into for two reasons. One is that they want a very sort of good education, traditional education in sort of their own history, which they know that if they go into accounting, economics, etc., sure, it has the practical value, but in terms of sort of self-development, they know they need that kind of education. So that's one way. But the other way has to do with that kind of creativity, where they want to use a humanities education as a creative tool as well. And I think like that's an avenue where, because I think humanities scholars tend to be very self-critical and critical of each other, that I think is super interesting to explore or to create a space for that isn't suffocating. Because I think a lot of people find it very suffocating, because so many scholars have such a huge amount of knowledge that their whole mode of rationality to any kind of creativity is to sort of place in a historical and cultural framework, which sort of already dismantles any attempt at creativity within the humanities, even though I think it's very important in relation to what James was saying, well, where is our field going to go? Because I think we're going to need new forms, new genres, new things for new times. I do think that is going to be super valuable as our field progresses, and I don't think that will mean sort of the downfall of old school literary criticism, any kind of new formalisms that are also underway. I don't think like those things, like it's one or the other. I think those two things can coexist. And probably space for creativity is needed there.
Sam.
I mean, it seems like we've sort of, Eric's question has expanded into a question broadly of like scholarly infrastructures, which seems, in keeping with the conversation from last time, both like our pedagogical infrastructures. I will confess, having had just a hell of a time in some of my classes, getting my students to just buy the books. If there's a PDF that they can find, like I try and make things available, but when they need, so I was just teaching Claudia Rankine Citizen. You need that book. Like the paper is high gloss paper. It resists your pen in a certain way and it smears when you write in it. The images are meant to be like bright and vibrant. The PDFs are janky and have weird sort of pagination, and it's not a kind of the same experience. And I have no idea what that's about. Like it's like $6, it's not a cost thing. I think it has to do with a kind of broader sense that this is peripheral. that it is not a kind of meaningful part of their education. It's a gen ed requirement. It's a thing they have to do. And so like and that ties into that kind of devaluing of the infrastructure of English departments broadly, chalk and talk, right? You got a stick of chalk, you got a classroom that can seat, 15 or 20 people, you got an English class. All you need is a contract worker and you're good to go. And the kind of the other part that I heard in Andres's comment had to do with like our infrastructure for scholarly communication. I mean, the problem is like all of our forms of communication are primarily, they're not forms of communication. That's the thing. They're credentials. We publish as a function of credentializing your first book. I was on a panel this last MLA, and an editor for the Penn State early modern series was like, yeah, no, this is what people get wrong about your first book. Your first book is not in fact a book, it is a credential. And just hearing an editor say that was like kind of mind-blowing, but also like, yes, that is absolutely right. That person she was totally correct. And so that's part of the problem, right? Is like the end is not communicating in a way that enriches our scholarly activity or contributes to knowledge in some meaningful way, but to achieve that credential. Sorry, Raquel, I know you're in the throes. The flip side of that is like from my work as an editor, I remember having this conversation with Marshall Brown, the former editor at MLQ, who's since retired and who is a legend among academic editors. I mean, maybe the best there was. And Marshall, was like, I get so tired of hearing about this crisis in publication, that nobody reads our stuff, that, like what the average journal article published in a humanities journal gets read by like one or two other people aside from the editor and the assistant editor. And that's not, and the two referees usually. But he was like, that's not the point. That's not why we write. And I actually kind of value that. We write to get our ideas and our thinking clear. Writing is itself the kind of infrastructure that supports our intellectual activity. And so like, that's why we write. That's why we submit our writing to other people, for them to be like, no, here's where you go sideways, or this is good and interesting. And so then the question is like, what role does that play in our actual practice, which is ultimately teaching? When our credentializing and our techniques for getting our thinking clear with our writing become totally divergent from our teaching, I think that's one way to name the problem that we currently have.
Absolutely. I want to jump in because, Eric, it's such a good question and it relates to so many things that I know. I mean, I know all of us have had a moment struggling when talking with students about a poem. You make an anecdote or an allusion or a reference, and instantly you're coming up short and you go, God, I need to be able to turn this place into a cinema right now and take 15 minutes and show you this famous scene from a movie. I had a course where I taught Williams's Patterson. It was a course on Patterson. And midway through, I instantly went, I'm not having these kids write papers. And so I contacted a friend, Patrick Kiley, who he publishes books, he's a printer, and I got them together and had them design zines, posters, they did podcasts, right? They sort of other media, pulling in other media. And the minute the pressure to write a paper turned off was the minute the poem came absolutely alive for them. And another problem is the only other kind of equipmental thinking we have, of course, is one justification we've used is, well, we'll teach people to write. Right. But now the problem I'm seeing increasingly is, well, the way you teach, writing almost has to be an in-class exercise or an in-office exercise, or they need to be able to see that these aren't distinctive modules of thinking, that they're all integrative, right? And that they have this kind of give and take. And, I hear colleagues say to me all the time, like, my students can't write. And if you start asking them questions like, well, do they get to choose what they write about? How many times do you force them to revise? I mean, what kinds of, to use your word, Andres, affects are you putting around this? I mean, I think there's huge trauma people have about reading, but it doubles when we go to writing. And then we're shutting down. I mean, then it's all getting it right. And so instead, if, you know, I try to say to my students all the time, when you're writing about the poem, I just want you to show your work like in math. Just show me how you're reading it. Tell me what's interesting. And then, you know, with a lot of handholding and a lot of conversation, things can start to really happen. But most of the students I deal with come into the class queued up. If it's not performance of mastery in the classroom discussion, I know what the poem means. Then it's, tell me, how do I get an A on the paper? What's the perfect form of the, and that just seems debilitating. Whereas if we had a different attitude towards this, I think, one, if we moved in that experimental direction, I think Eric is saying we would need to advocate for needing more money, needing more space. And that would also require us, you know, probably giving more positive proposals, and probably also, I think, resisting some of the general tendencies towards learning objectives and assessment. And that seems hard if we're stuck in the only ways we identify and talk to each other are these highly routinized things. Sam.
I mean, I just have to mention, I shared this with James. I'm on a faculty subcommittee at University of Washington in the humanities division, tasked with rewriting. Basically, there exists no rationale for the humanities gen ed requirement, which is dumbfounding. That there exists no written rationale for why you have to take X number of courses to fulfill a humanities degree, whether you're going to be an engineer or an English major in the university. And obviously that's a problem. So they're finally redressing it and trying to come up with language. And one of the things that our subcommittee has been tasked with doing is combing syllabuses for exactly that, learning objectives. And it's like, surprise, they're all like critical thinking, like they don't think critically in computer science, right? Like they don't think about design problems and how to solve them, which is basically critical thinking. Like they don't think critically as nursing students. I mean, it's so frustrating because it is a kind of a demand for a kind of propositional list of things, you know, knowing that that it seems largely at odds with our disciplinary practices and our value. But then how do we stand, exactly as James was saying, in front of the budget? How do we write a rationale for humanities gen ed requirements? How do we write that rationale when we can't actually find that language?
Yeah. Are there other folks here who have things to ask or contribute? I will continue banging on, but yeah, Richard.
Hi, so I'm a PhD student still at UW, and thank you both for the discussion. It's been nice to kind of like to hear a lot of common themes and worries. But so I'm kind of wondering about a different way that literature can be equipped for living. So I specialize in science fiction and contemporary science fiction and that, and I am looking at it as a way that the writers, the creators, and their kind of readers, fans, audience are trying to work out how do we as a society kind of deal with these huge issues that we're having about ecological breakdown, about, you know, the role of technology in like life, what happens when AI systems, you know, take over even like even the creative professions, you know. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about kind of treating living, not like personal living, like finding how to live, what is life, why do I live, but also kind of like living in society as a species.
Ooh, brilliant question. Andres, Sam, who wants to?
I mean, I think that's one of the things that Burke says in that essay is that, like, you know, history is constantly turning up new situations. History is constantly creating new contexts for new works. And he uses the metaphor of like a dictionary. And so, like, every work that sort of names something, some situation, some set of experiences is like a new word in the dictionary. And so the dictionary is constantly growing. And so you have, like, you know, a Madame Bovary, you have a Paradise Lost, you have a Neuromancer, you have what's the one that I have regularly been teaching, the short stories from Octavia Butler. Anyway, that names something, right? It names a set of situations or experiences, and helps us. I don't know. I mean, a critical reading would be like it reconciles us or accommodates us to what could otherwise be like, yeah, the conquest of our creative lives by artificial intelligence, learning programs, or the kind of total cyborgian takeover of the human organism, which is like one of Butler's favorite themes, and that it makes it familiar and therefore kind of domesticates it, and anesthetizes what is really like potentially appalling about the way those things work in our world. I don't want to read it in that way, but I'm not sure, like, does it create, I don't know, Williams's thing, a structure of feeling by which we can actually come to comment on and create James uses the word perch, a kind of perch on these things from which we can actually evaluate them and actually get a handle on the way they're organizing our bodies, our spaces, our social and creative lives.
Yeah. Andres, feel free. Eric, also, I know you have thought about this question, but I know you also need to leave, so no pressure. But Andres.
Yeah, I think like it's a really good question, because like when you sort of look at what is the rhetorical legitimacy of something like AI or any kind of modern technology that's sort of come about, it's always about making life easier. Like if you look at the slogans or sort of the way these products are marketed, it's about making life easier. And I had this conversation with a student last week. He was showing me like this new AI product, and like the slogan was, well, you know, we'll take care of your text for you so you can do the really important stuff, right? And I think like this is a real crisis that's happening right now, like, because he was saying, he was talking to me, it's like, what's the really important stuff, you know, jerking off, like, is that what's left, you know, like, but like this whole feeling that like technology can help you is of course in tension with the very fact that technology is also taking things away from you that you actually enjoyed, right? Where we're sort of like stuck on a strain that everybody, I think, is sensing, where we're developing technology. We don't really know how it affects us once it's out there, right? I think that's been happening ever since social media became big. Like we introduced technology where you have the very classic Frankenstein paradigm of introducing something, not really knowing how it's going to sort of affect you back. And then once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back in, right? It's still the same ethical paradigm that we're in with AI, I think. But the whole problem is, and I think this is where the humanities and the arts are super important, is that, yeah, like these things, they can take these tasks off our hand, but then what is actually going to make life meaningful? And if the meaningful parts of life are being put to the margins, right, that's a very weird, alienating life. And I think a lot of people are experiencing exactly that, where, you know, if you can have AI write your essay, you know, that also means that AI is literally taking the chance away from you to have those thoughts and to have those thoughts develop in your mind as you're growing. And I think like that's a very disconcerting at a sort of a subconscious or unconscious level to a lot of people, where we all feel like, you know, that's off in a way. but we don't, I think, have the language yet to sort of address it, because we also see those instrumental and practical values that these tools can bring us, but at the same time, they're sort of pushing everything that's meaningful to our lives to the margins, because they're increasing at super fast rates.
Brilliant.
I mean, I like, Andres, I love what you said about a Frankenstein paradigm, just because that's exactly what Burke is saying, right? There's a certain, I mean, that text is from 1833. There's a certain kind of situational analogy, I mean, like the word paradigm, Daston writes a lot about that. It's like flexible, it's not closed off, it's not algorithmic, but it involves a kind of like play of similarity and dissimilarity. Like this is like as to that other thing. So I think that as an example is actually perfect to kind of answering Richard's question about the kind of Burkean equipment, because it's an example, right? It demonstrates exactly the utility of that kind of way of thinking and using literature.
Yeah. I would say one other thing to get to the life in big sense, you know, I'm teaching right now an upper division course on Ellison's Invisible Man to a bunch of graduating seniors who are very anxious about their future and their plans. And what's great is that is a book that sort of explodes the notion of Bildungsroman, right? It is this ironic, layered, beautiful, amazing commentary on it. But it is as if many of the students reading this book for the first time have realized they are members of a species. That is what they're going through. Other people have gone through. And for this group of people who spent 2 years of school inside with COVID-19 and lots of pressure about being practical and on time and employable, it has been, on the one hand, kids are literally starting to well up with tears reading this novel, seeing how much foolishness they've accepted, and watching Invisible bang his head over and over again. And students too have recognized that inside of the progressive linear thought of the Bildungsroman is a similar problem to technological fixes, to this idea that we can just, you know, put our heads down and pretend nothing is happening, or continue in the same manner, let technology take more and more of the burden off of us. I mean, in that book, Ellison is insistent that life becomes meaningful for human beings in making mistakes, in having limitation and struggle, that is part of what gives us our distinctive life world. And that one of the things it's meant to be an American is to run crazily away from that. So I don't have an easy answer, but it does seem to me that maybe not humanities as knowledge production, but the literary classroom as a space of being together and of developing capacities that are sort of endangered really does have something to do with life and species. And of course, when I've taught science fiction, that's always what comes out, you know, is that they go, oh, Ballard wrote this in 1968 and it looks like today and we can talk about it finally. I know, Sam, you were nearing time, but I wanted to make space for Eric, maybe? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, this has been great. And to make a sort of similar play, maybe to Sam's key and key, right? I've been thinking about practice and practice as tied to Richard's question. And, you know, I don't want to give any spoilers to people who are watching Picard or The Mandalorian, but I've been struck this week by how each one of those is kind of dealing with sort of like land back themes on one hand, and sort of AI and the sort of takeover of what is human, you know, through this kind of very popular lens, and the kind of conventional argument about science fiction that comes through, you know, even this is like that it's sort of a practice ground, right? As in like, this is the fake area where we're dealing with the sort of the real thing over here. But it's like, when we've been talking about a practice of reading, I think there's also like this very real, like the practice is real, right? Or to kind of go to sports, which is never where I go to make analogies, but today I'm here. You know, I've been thinking a lot about gymnastics. Weirdly, I'm not a gymnast. I have none of those skills, but like every time you're doing a gymnastics routine, you're sort of doing the thing. Whereas a lot of other sports, you go to practice and you're sort of like doing it, off stage for the moment when you will play in front of the crowd. And I've been thinking of that too, right? The sort of like, yeah, so how to
I guess
have it
dance
be
would be similar, right? Like a dance routine. Yeah, that's a great analogy.
So I don't know, there's something in there, and it's not really a conclusion, but I was just thinking about practices and sort of like how science fiction is, sometimes dismissed, but actually like, in popular culture right now, especially is the ground where things that are sort of unspeakable in the sort of, political nonfiction realm can actually be like very openly explored, and sort of like just distorted so that people aren't like, wait a minute, are these Mandalorians taking back North America? Like, no, but yeah, they are.
Brilliant, Eric. Jay, it looks like you had something.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So I'm a poet and writer, and I'm getting my master's right now. And something that Andres said early on that keeps coming back up is like how literature as equipment for living is necessarily social, and yet it is kind of a paradox that what makes it social is that we don't have immediate access to what the other experiences, which makes me think of like Levinas and The Face, and like the necessary unknowability of the other or whatever. But it's interesting that equipment is supposed to increase access, at least like conventionally. Equipment, like, or all this talk about technology, like there's a way that it can increase access as if that's like universally a good thing. So I'm just thinking about in terms of the classroom as James was saying, like a place of being in the world together. And I visited a class to an intro to poetry class, and this was this week, and I asked everyone who writes poems that isn't like who would be writing poems outside of this class, and only like maybe a third of the class raised their hand. And then I was like, well, who journals? And then almost everybody raised their hand. And I was just like, well, there's something that like there's this disconnect. And I think this ties into enunciation and the lyric. There's this like assumption that I don't write poems because I only journal or something like that, when it's like, no, like that's it. The whole idea of practice is that, journaling is a type of practice where you're practicing living on the page. And so I'm just wondering, maybe as a question, like, where does, there was a little bit of talk about creativity, and I guess I'm wondering how do you build creativity into a syllabus that is outside of a creative writing class? I took a class in pedagogy last semester, and the teacher left a whole unit blank for the students to come up if they wanted to fill in the syllabus with what interests them. So I wonder if like there's a way, and maybe this goes back to infrastructure, but I'm thinking of like equipment as both in and outside of the classroom, and how like being together in the classroom would encourage us to be together outside of the classroom like we're doing now.
Wonderful, Jay. That's so rich. Andres, I can see you're poised for something.
Yeah, like one of the things that I often think about is, so you were talking about journaling, and I think a lot of writing, just as a lot of, or actually all reading, it's a solitary practice, right? So especially in humanities, most literary scholars, they write solo, right? So if I ask like your show of hands, like who's co-written an article, right? It's always a testy subject with humanities scholars. And then like if you ask them, what did you write it like with two writers, like it's very clear sort of who's speaking, or did you actually write with a single voice? And then if you increase to 3 authors, and my whole point with that is like, I think we have a very rich tradition of sort of the tortured genius, like you have your own thoughts, and trying to develop your thought. But my take on that is also like, yeah, I get that track and I get that history. I think it definitely has value, but it's also possible to not think about the development of your thought, but of the development of thought, right? So where sort of the possessive noun sort of gets placed to the background in terms of its importance. And I think to come back to your your suggestion, Jay, of sort of leaving something blank in a syllabus, sort of to me plays into that kind of thing. So where I ask my students, like, well, if you would decide to co-write and all of you, all three or all four of you are the co-author of this piece, but you're writing with one single voice, what would that do? And like usually the response is discomfort, right? Because they're not trained in that, they know, but that's exactly my pedagogical point, right? So that's kind of a practice that I think is very common in other academic disciplines that we don't often adopt, that I think is still very fertile and rich for development. So, and then I think one of the major learning points for at least for literary studies, but probably also other humanities disciplines, is not to sort of go to the side of critique right away, right? So there are always counter arguments to say, well, you shouldn't do that because ... And there are good arguments why you shouldn't do that, or like why the whole tortured genius legacy has innate value, and I'm not against that. But the whole problem with critique as an initial or like the only possible response is that you choke off these kinds of exercises. So that's sort of where I'm at in terms of sort of the blank space in the humanities curriculum, is to sort of try these exercises where it's more about teamwork, more about literally writing and working together also on the page and seeing what that does. And you know, if it is an inconvenience, show me why it became an inconvenience. What did you learn from that? And yeah, sort of create that kind of space.
I mean,
I would just add,
we're on that spatial metaphor, and you know, the organizing idea is a spatial one, meeting places. And Andres, as you were talking about blank spaces, I was both thinking about one of Burke's other keywords, which is communion, and the kind of the space in which we commune with texts that exist in a kind of present in that space, and also the space at, I don't know, the end of the line, that space in between stanzas, that silence, which is the condition of music and sound, which is that kind of that collaborative communal space, or it can be when our work is not sort of tied to that mythology of the genius marshaling great thoughts and then transducing them into language.
yeah, I would say, Jay, the question is just so rich, in part because I know it's a wider trend, but here at Albany, we've seen a large decline in English majors, but we created a minor in creative writing, and it's just this explosion. And some of it is from the interest in gaming, in online culture, that people really want to write. And I've had lots of writers flocking to my classroom. In some way, it's reinvigorated my old formalism, that and my tendency towards vulgarity and emphasis on writing as coming out of experiences in the world, which writers just know. And then what's so neat is when you have real practitioners in the game, it's so funny to hear how, a writer does not approach the literary text in the mode of mastery at all. That is so uninteresting to them. And that's a huge sense of permissiveness for the other students in the room, which is something that, again, it might allow us to reopen, well, why would someone want to read Paradise Lost? And it turns out that's a totally silly question if you're talking to people who are interested in RPGs or fantasy video games, or this is the rich material of popular culture right now, and we've just kind of abandoned it, frankly. And I find that with in Invisible Man, a student, Andres, it was great you were talking about comic books and frames. Photographic frames are a huge part of Ellison's sort of aesthetic, and I've got this guy who's just a huge reader of DC Comics. And he shows up and it's like this explosive close reading where he's showing me, he's teaching me, no, this is written like a panel. You know, I don't know that. I don't know video game, or sorry, the comic book aesthetics and plotting. And then he shows it, you know, he's explaining it to all of us in the class. And it's like, obviously it is. So there's, you know, the problem maybe that you were pointing to, Andres, where we're inclined to shut down, be critical, wall off. It's like, you know, maybe we can reopen things about the canon wars and cultural studies and popular culture and high culture and the differences between writing and you know, maybe it is time in this moment of worry to really make space, right? To hold that space to say, well, let's see what can happen if we renegotiate some of the assumed boundaries between these things, bearing in mind always, and I, you know, to return to Eric's point, that we have to be also explicit about we need money and space and acknowledgement, you know, that this can't be something that we're just doing in hopes of preserving enrollments in our classes, right? That it has to be, you know, I love the late Hazard Adams book, you know, The Offense of Poetry. No defenses of poetry. Let's offend them. Let's make a sort of positive enunciation and proposal for the importance of a meeting place in the classroom, you know, that the creative and the critical have a different relation, right? All of these seem right. Sam, I just want to check, you got to leave soon, right?
Yeah, I gotta run. I have a memorial I gotta get to. So
Okay.
I just want to say thank you, everyone. It was wonderful. This was a really rich and rewarding conversation. So
Excellent.
I greatly appreciate the time and getting to talk with all you wonderful folks. It was really helpful.
Good. Excellent stuff, Sam. Feel free to take off. I think, you know,
Yeah, keep talking. Don't wait on me. I'll see you guys.
Cool. Great.
Thanks,
Thanks, Sam.
Bye-bye.
I think we could probably take 5 or 10 more minutes if there's any juice left in the tank or questions that want to be asked. And if not, I'm happy to sort of conclude the session now. Either way.
Yeah, I just have one comment. Like you were talking about the crisis in humanities, James, and I think one of the conundrums that I'm also sort of dealing with is if you look at the vocabularies that the humanities have contributed to contemporary cultural and political discourse, that's huge, right? So if you look at gender studies, critical race, post-colonial studies, decolonial studies, all of these huge fields of study that have seeped into almost all areas of our political and cultural discourse across news media, which actually has a very, like in that sense, a very strong practical and tangible value, but somehow we are unable to sort of say, you know, we contributed to that, like we contributed to contemporary thinking about gender, we are contributing to the discussion in the United States about abortion rights, you know, that's all humanities. And I think that's a super important link that somehow, I think people know that in a way, like they know it subconsciously, I think, but I think it's really difficult to explicate that added value. But I think if you took the humanities out of the equation, that whole discussion would really change dramatically, I think. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was sent a wonderful essay by Jonathan Arac recently, which is in part a response to John Guillory's recent book. And it makes a very pointed point that Lionel Trilling is left out of that book. Lionel Trilling is almost always left out. Trilling was seen as kind of this, you know, hero of middlebrow culture and, you know, not theoretical enough and too cynical and too liberal. And but Trilling had a really concrete sense of the relations between criticism, literature, life, and politics. And that Trilling would advocate, right? You know, you need to read Henry James if you're a liberal, right? He had all of these wonderful sort of points. And it's one of the things I think you're exactly right to point on. One of my thoughts about that is in part our tendency towards discrete learning objectives, phrases, specialized knowledge. we might have unwittingly kind of lost the trail back to ourselves. That is, as they function in the public sphere, and this is maybe my cranky humanist coming out, they are really reduced, oversimplified versions, right? And what we miss, of course, is that those insights were forged out of classroom exercises, conversations, that all of these things have to, in some way it's, my Williams, no ideas but in things. Here it would be kind of, no ideas but in these common practices and ways of being together. And, we could sort of adopt that. But it does seem right. I mean, Richard has noted that that's a good point for Sam to think about. That is, how can we reestablish the notion that it's not just that we're contributing to good citizenship and all of that, but we're enabling people to be involved in a different way in a political discourse that technology and all the things we've been talking about have made massive parts of our daily life, and they have real social consequence and real personal consequence for people. So it is another rationale for why you should step in and learn to think slowly and be uncomfortable. And I mean, I think that's a really great point, Andres. Anything else before we close out of here? Well, I really appreciate all you guys coming. I wanted to shout out quickly that the last session will be of the Meeting Places event. So our third and final session will be on April 28th at 4 Eastern, not 3 Eastern. And that's going to be a conversation between Christina Thyssen and the novelist and writer Jackie S., who's a close friend of mine and a great novelist. That is going to be Tales, Tall and Otherwise, the uses of stories. So I think here there's going to be some continuity that will carry through. So you're all invited to join us. Thanks, Raquel. Yeah, great of you to have you at the end. Well, have a great one, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you,
You
James.
got it.
For this.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.